Hello, welcome to the Law, Policing and Justice Podcast, episode 10, and I hope you're all well. My name is Nuran Chowdhury. I'm the Supervising Solicitor, leading the Legal Advice Centre and a lecturer at the University of East London. So, in today's episode, we will be discussing the topic on employment law. We have a brilliant guest today, Lawrence Davis, who is a prominent UK solicitor and the founder of law firm Equal Justice Solicitors. He's known for his work in fighting discrimination and promoting equality in the workplace. Lawrence has represented individuals in a wide range of cases, including those involving race, sex, age, and disability discrimination. He is a strong advocate for fair treatment and equal opportunities for all. Lawrence has built a remarkable reputation in employment law, earning widespread recognition from major publications. The Daily Mail describes Lawrence as an employment law expert, while The Independent refers to him as a leading employment lawyer. Lawrence's advocacy for whistleblowers has earned him the title of a champion for whistleblowers in the Sunday Times, and The Observer has called Lawrence a lifeline for race victims. Lawrence has also been recognised as a top lawyer by The Mirror, and according to BBC Newsnight, that he may be the only UK lawyer to have taken on and beaten the USA in court. As Michelle Massey, the King's Counsel, put it, Lawrence is a leader in employment law and a tenacious fighter, and that his impact on employment law is undeniable. Lawrence is also one of our partners who also works closely with our Legal Advice Centre on employment law matters. And on behalf of the Legal Advice Centre, I just want to say a big thank you for so much that you've done for our students and for our clients as well. Honestly, your work is actually going unnoticed. So Lawrence, today I'll let our students introduce themselves and then put their questions forward to you all. Over to you all.
Hi, Mr. Davis. My name is Fawaz Ahmed. I'm a level 4 student currently pursuing my LLB honours at the University of East London.
Hi, my name is Tazjan Hassan and I'm a level 4 student at University of East London.
Hello, my name is Abdullah Qureshi and I'm level 4 student I'm doing LLB honours in business law.
Hello, my name is Deepak Verma. I'm doing masters from University of East London.
Yeah, so Mr. Davis, we'll be asking you questions today. We have loads of them about employment. The first one being, what are the most common employment law issues employees face today?
Probably the most common wage-related claims, pay-related claims. So that probably takes most cases. Equal pay claims are also quite numerous. And then after that, unfair dismissal, and then discrimination claims probably after that.
So can you explain the difference between an employee and an independent contractor, and why is it so important legally?
In employment law, you have three sort of status for workers. Employee has most rights, then self-employed have very little rights. And between the two, there's something called a casual worker or a Lim 1B worker. And they have some of the rights of employees, but not all. Okay, so if you're purely self-employed and you're discriminated against at work, you can't sue under the Equality Act. If, however, you seem to be self-employed, but you're actually an independent casual worker, then you can sue. Employees can bring claims for redundancy and unfair dismissal. Workers can't. Okay, so it's a sort of a hierarchy of rights. If you're at the top, as an employee, you're at the top. If you're self-employed, you're at the bottom. And then there's a balance of power within the workplace. So you may choose to be self-employed for tax reasons or because you want to work for multiple clients, but often that may be what the employer wants you to be categorised, even though you're working 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. The reason for that is when they don't have to pay national insurance, you have far fewer rights, and they can dispense with your services much more easily than they could with an employee.
Thank you so much. The next question I would like to ask is, how can employees protect themselves from workplace discrimination or harassment?
So, in theory, you're protected under the Equality Act 2010.
Yeah.
So under the Equality Act 2010, you can't be discriminated against or harassed or subject to victimisation at work. But in practice, the legislation doesn't work. So you have to distinguish between the right that you apparently have not to be discriminated and the reality. So the reality is, for example, 30% of black workers will be racially harassed at work, and only 1% of those victims will exercise their rights under the Equality Act. The reason for that is that you have about a 99% chance of retaliation if you complain of racism. They're very expensive cases to run. Only 4% of cases win, and they often attract low awards. and you're often dismissed in the process having complained of racism. So 99% of racist incidents in the workplace currently go unchallenged, which means workplaces they don't change, they haven't evolved. And the position on the ground now is worse than it was 15 years ago. So the levels of racial harassment in the workplace are worse today than they were 15 years ago. That's also for structural reasons, because there are structural blockers, and it's also because of something called the culture wars. Do you know about the culture wars?
I would like to know if
Okay. After George Floyd Jr. was murdered, Black Lives Matter movement began, and it was noticed here that a lot of the people who supported Black Lives Matter then supported the Democrats in the next election. So they mobilised the black vote. And so here, to avoid the black vote being mobilised here, the Conservative government initiated something called the Culture Wars, which was to ensure that black people never got above their station. In particular, you saw that in something called the Windrush attack, which was the Home Office, which is a government department and institutionally racist, came up with the idea of the hostile environment. So the hostile environment is they deliberately set out to make the Windrush generation, so people who came here from the Caribbean in the 1950s, uncomfortable living in the UK, even if they've lived here for 50 years or more. They did that by requiring all members of the Windrush generation to prove that they're here legitimately. One of the ways in which they chose to do that was to ask them to produce their medical records from birth. If they couldn't do that, that was one point to challenge. But what you have to understand is a deliberately and intended racist policy to make essentially British people feel uncomfortable living in Britain. And that was part of the culture wars. It also meant that the Equality and Human Rights Commission was weaponised. And for example, Liz Truss said in December 20, I'm appointing a new chair and 4 new commissioners to the Commission for Racial Equality to carry out the government's agenda. That's supposed to be an independent body, but they took it over. Staff at the Equality and Human Rights Commission were forbidden from making any findings of institutional racism anywhere, even if they had the evidence for it, which is why they didn't find it in the Metropolitan Police, but Baroness Casey did on pretty much the same data. So we are living in a situation further to Brexit, when you had the sort of anti-foreigner sentiment was used to mobilise people. Racial harassment in the workplace went from 16% in 2016 to 31% in 2020. It's got worse since, because the centre and far right have been mobilised by that sentiment, and the Reform Party has 4 million voters. Did you read the Reform Party's manifesto?
Okay.
Yeah? Did you notice that they are promising to abolish the Equality Act? That means that there'll be no protection at all against racism or sexism in the workplace or in education in future if they get into power. They will be taking Britain back to the early 1970s, where you can call someone the N-word in the workplace and there's nothing you can do about it. If a woman becomes pregnant, she gets sacked immediately, because that was a standard reaction to pregnancy in the 70s. There's nothing you'll be able to do about it. And you might think, well, that's never going to happen, but they have 4 million voters already, and they're trying to get to 10 million. There's also a new group called BRUV, which is Britain Restoring Underlying Values, which is a new political party set up by Andrew Tate in January this year. 27% of men aged between 19 and 38 say his views about women are correct. So do not underestimate him, because he's got Musk and a lot of American money behind him. And he says he wants to be Britain's next Prime Minister. Farage has already said he doesn't think it's a legitimate political party, but he's been very careful not to criticise Tate's followers. Lastly, Labour are now in power, so we're hoping for some positive changes on racism, and we're introducing the new Race Act and also amending the Equality Act and producing some more employment rights, all of which is good, but the problem is they are trying to modify legislation that just does not work. So if you add something to the Equality Act, like intersectionality, given that only 1% of victims use it, it's not going to make any difference to the 99% who feel failed by the legislation. That's the problem. So you'll see the Labour will introduce the changes, but in practice it will make no difference at all.
Thank you, Lewis. And my next question is, what should someone do if they believe they've been wrongfully terminated?
If someone has been wrongfully terminated, then they should take legal advice as soon as possible. So, if you're wrongly terminated, the thing to remember is that the time limits are really severe. So, if you buy a television, today, and it doesn't work, how long do you have to sue for it? 6 years. 6 years for any breach of contract.
Oh, no.
Okay? If I shout and scream at you now in this meeting and you have a nervous breakdown, how long do you have to sue me for that personal injury?
3 years.
3 years. Yeah. If I shout and scream at you and call you lots of racist names, how long do you have to sue for it? Even if I cause you the same psychological damage?
4 to 5.
3 months less a day. So it's an identical claim to personal injury, but they set up a law that you'd only have 3 months less a day to sue because they didn't want you to have an exercisable right. Yeah. They also put in, when it came in the 70s, they put a cap on compensation, which was completely illegal. So women were routinely sacked for being pregnant in the early 70s. And so the Sex Discrimination Act was supposed to stop that, wasn't it? When the first pregnancy case went through the courts, the judges, mostly male judges, said, for direct discrimination you need a comparator. So what's a comparator for a pregnant woman? It's a man with a 9-month medical condition that means he has to take a lot of time off work. And as it wouldn't be wrong to sack a man with a 9-month medical condition, it's not wrong to sack a woman who's pregnant. So for 10 years, not a single British judge in this country could see that as only women can become pregnant, if you're treating someone negatively for being pregnant, you're treating them negatively for being a woman.
Yeah.
Not a single judge in this country could spot that. Or they could spot it, but they just never wanted women to have that right. So it was a European Court of Justice, actually, a case called Webb, intervened and said, as only women can get pregnant, if you're treating someone negatively for being pregnant, you're treating them negatively for being a woman. So, and then the law changed. And so if you were sacked for being pregnant, you could sue. But again, as I said, only 1% of people are using merit rights under that legislation. So you protect yourself by taking legal advice early because the time limits are so short. The Labour Party are helpfully increasing that time limit from 3 months to 6 months less a day. But still, you have 3 years for a personal injury. So why is, for example, a white guy or a white woman who's then shouted at without any discriminatory comment having 3 years to sue, but if she has the same nervous breakdown because of sexism or racism, she only has 3 months or 6 months. So it's still set up to prevent people from being able to exercise their rights. And the other thing on protection is, if you get into a battle, you need funding. Okay, so there's not much legal aid, and it doesn't protect you in terms of funding the case, and it's hard to access. The free legal advice services in Britain are being under-resourced and closing. So you need either to crowdfund, which is some people are very successful in crowdfunding, or take out home contents insurance. Because in the 1990s, home contents insurance, they added legal expenses cover against employment disputes. So 15% of our clients are funded through their home contents insurance, even though they didn't know they had that protection when they came in through the door. So if you have protected characteristics, or you think you're likely to speak up when you see something illegal in the workplace, it's good to take out home contents insurance. It's about 400 quid a year. You can take it out if you're renting or you bought somewhere. And then if you do have problems in the workplace, you have a 25 to 100k legal pot to fight back. And remember, only 1% of people who don't have lawyers, only 1% of litigants in person win their cases. So you have a 99% chance of failure unless you can secure good enough funding. So watch time limits, secure funding. Secure funding before the event happens.
So the next question I have is, how does employment law vary for different types of workers? So for example, full-time, how would be different for the part-time and then remote workers?
You tend to have more rights as a full-time worker, although you do have rights as a part-time worker, less so as a remote worker. But it all comes down to your financial power to litigate if you have to. Logically, full-time workers probably have more money, more pay, and therefore will recover a larger reward if they win. So they're probably in a better position. But as I said, the problem in our society is not the rights that we have insofar as they're written down. It's the fact that none of them are particularly enforceable. So it doesn't really matter what rights you have because you're not going to be able to enforce them. So we have a cosmetic rights system. And because of that, people rarely feel that they have achieved justice.
So you just mentioned about the rights.
Yeah.
My next question is, what are some of the key laws that protect workers in the UK?
Well, in terms of discrimination, it's the Equality Act 2010, which the government are going to build on. One of the good things the Labour government are going to do is they're going to introduce intersectionality, or what's called multiple discrimination or double discrimination. So at the moment, if you're black female and you argue a case for racism and sexism, your comparator on the race as a black female is a white female or a white male. But the moment you get into a comparator that is of the same gender, you're undermining your sex discrimination case. On the sex side, of course, then your comparator can also interfere with your race case, because it could be, on the sex side, it could be a black male comparator. So you're arguing against yourself, and each strand has to be argued individually, whereas most black females or black guys are going to say, I'm being discriminated against for who I am. You can't sort of separate me out into two different types of people. And so it was always envisaged that if you had more than one protected characteristic, you could just choose one comparator and that would stand, and it'd be so much easier to prove. The government is going to introduce multiple discrimination, which was actually part of the legislation in 2010, but was never formally introduced. On the other hand, given that only 1% of victims of racism and sexism actually complain, it's going to make no difference to 99% of victims. So we're going to be back where we were. If you go back, do you remember the Me Too movement? Can you remember that? Yeah?
Yep.
So you had Jennifer Lawrence and other actors in Hollywood speaking up about equal pay, because California had no equal pay protection, and they forced or persuaded the Californian government to introduce equal pay protection, which was great. So then there was a lot about speaking up about sexual harassment, speaking up about equal pay, and there's a group called the the Union of Female Farmers. So the women the female farmers wrote to Jennifer Lawrence and their group and said, look, we're on $1-2 an hour. We can't stand up, because if we stand up we just get sacked. So they set up something called the Time's Up Fund. Have you ever heard of that? Okay. They raised $20 million. It's a litigation fund for all victims of sexual harassment. So in this country and in America, 30% of women under the age of 30 will suffer sexual harassment at work. It's exactly the same stat, okay? In America, 6% of women would complain, 94% would just try to survive it. In Britain, 1% would complain, 99% would just try to survive it. After Me Too, and because of the litigation fund, it went up to 12 or 14% in America, okay? In Britain, we raised £2 million here. It's administered by the Rosa Fund. What did we spend that money on? Any idea? Counselling. So you speak up as a woman, you feel empowered, you go to the Rosa Fund and say, can you help me? And they say, yeah, we can give you counselling. They say, that's great. And then they say, well, I want to sue the guy because he hasn't been sacked. And I still feel uncomfortable at work. And they say, well, we can't help you back because there's no funding. So the take-up for sexual harassment cases after Me Too in the UK is still 1%. It has not changed at all. So for about 3 to 6 months after Me Too, if a male senior director manager was accused of sexual harassment, most businesses would sack them. After a year, they stopped sacking them, and now they just cover it up. So we had a case where a man sexually harassed 7 women at a work party, multiple witnesses, he was not sacked. And the women were too scared to sue because they'll get retaliated against, they'll lose their jobs. So now we're back where we were. So Me Too has made very little difference in terms of the enforceability of rights. So the Equality Act still remains unenforceable, which leads me to the next point, which is that having done this for about 20 years, my firm's 20 years old next month, we've done 4,000 cases, brought in about 50 million in compensation and 4 of the UK's top awards. We've made very little difference whatsoever to the structure of society, because I know on the ground racial harassment is worse than it was 15 years ago. So 80-hour weeks for 20 years have made very little difference apart from to my clients. So now we're trying to look at more structural responses to the situation, because that's the only way that things will change. And one of the structural responses is to abolish the Equality Act and replace it with an Inequality Act that has enforceable rights. Because if you have enforceable rights, you could make a real difference. We have to go from a culture where 99% of victims are scared to speak up and fear retaliation to a situation where most people who suffer sexual harassment or racial harassment have the confidence in the system to speak up and achieve justice. At present, we do not have a justice system that works, according to most victims.
Thank you so much. Such a detailed and amazing answer. I would love to shift the topic towards now an employer. And my next question is, what should an employer do to ensure they are compliant with employment law?
Yeah, it's not very difficult to ensure that you're compliant with employment law, although it does change quite quickly, and the Labour government are introducing quite a lot of new rights that are coming in. So one thing is to have regular training on employment rights.
Okay.
2 is to monitor your outcomes. So monitor what percentage, for example, of black people are promoted, what percentage of black people have failed in promotion, what percentage of black people you're subjecting to a disciplinary or misconduct process. Look for disproportionalities or disparities. If there are no disproportionalities and disparities, you're probably doing a good job. About 5% of employers in this country are inclusive, which means that if you report discrimination to them, they will do something about it, and they are the best of the best. About 95% of employers panic when we're accused of discrimination and tend to deny and cover up. The problem with the system is that, I don't know if you know this, but if you suffer discrimination in the workplace, your right as a worker or employee is to bring what's called a grievance. That sounds quite good, and it's heard by an independent person within the business, but 99% of grievances are rejected. The reason for that is the employer cannot admit to a manager having discriminated against you, because you could then sue them and they can't defend the case. So institutionally, they have to deny it, and they always do. And what the victim finds is that it was bad enough being sexually harassed or racially harassed by the individual, but maybe they knew that guy was a sexist or racist, so kind of it was predictable. What they couldn't predict is the independent grievance manager from a different part of your business or employer then doesn't see it and doesn't believe you, and sometimes even counterattacks against you. That's what's truly shocking. And then sometimes your union rep turns against you as well if they're too close to the employer. So it's the victimization and the retaliation and the lack of support from everyone else afterwards, and your friends at your work turning against you because they're scared too and told not to associate with you, that causes a lot of the trauma in that process. So for good employers, the good news is if you're good on inclusivity and diversity, you'll make more money. You'll have more customers, you'll have a more energized and happy workforce. All the research says you make more money if you're good on diversity. All of it. Okay? So Trump's thing about DEI and scrapping it all is counterproductive to business unless you believe business should be run in this way, that you give people no rights whatsoever, and you keep costs to a minimum, and you destroy anyone who gets in your way. If that's your model of business, which is what we had in the Victorian period, yeah, that's right. But what sort of society do you create if you follow that path?
Thank you. And my next question is, what are some common misconceptions about employment law that you frequently encounter?
Yeah, I think the main misconception is that we have a justice system that works. The second misconception is that you have rights that you can enforce. It is absolutely tragic to watch people who are victims of discrimination and actually have the courage to stand up or have no choice but to stand up, then get absolutely mashed by the system. I mean, the average award for discrimination at the moment is about £12,000. That's not a lot for going through discrimination. And normally you have to spend 30 to 40,000 to get the £12,000, and you don't get your costs even if you win. So even if you win, you're 20 to 30,000 pounds worse off, and you've probably lost your job. The best way I can explain, there's two big stories I can tell you, well, three actually, but first story is this. There was a woman who worked in America for SmithKline Beecham, which is a big pharmaceutical company, one of the biggest in the world. She discovered that the drug they were putting out was, in human trials, had killed or severely injured people who had taken it, okay, from side effects. They suppressed that finding so they could put the drug out in the market. They made hundreds of millions of dollars through that, okay. In America, if you whistleblow, when the Department of Justice or some other government body, the Securities Exchange Commission, prosecute, as a whistleblower, you're entitled to up to 15% of what they recovered. They recovered a lot of money. That whistleblower, she got $96 million. The lawyer, because in the States all lawyers act on what's called a no-win, no-fee basis, the lawyer gets 10%. So that lawyer got $9.6 million from that case, yeah? So I spoke with him at Cambridge University, and he had a really beautiful tailored suit, and I was still in my sort of like, I was not looking as good as this guy. And I said, look, if that same lady had had the same job title, head of development, working in the UK, had found that the same drug had caused the same damage to UK people and had reported it, number one, she probably wouldn't have won because whistleblowers very rarely win in the UK because they have to run the case themselves. Number two, if she had won, she would have got about $250,000. I said, would she have whistleblown in the UK over exactly the same harm done to UK people? And he said, hell no. She deserved every cent of the $96 million. She will never, ever work again in the pharmaceutical industry. Her career is over. That's why the UK system doesn't work. we don't have punitive damages. So if you think about it, if you're suing McDonald's or a large corporation for racism and you get £12,000, is that going to change the corporate culture in McDonald's? It's not. It's a corporate lunch. It's a joke. Yeah, it's an absolute joke. But the courts in this country have said if they award more than £20,000 in punitive damages, it might bring the British system into disrepute. Missing the fact that the point of punitive damages is not to compensate, it's to punish the wrongdoing employer to an extent that they learn and it prevents future breaches of the law. £12,000 or £20,000 is nothing to a multi-billion corporation. It's just a joke. So actually, the current system brings our law into disrepute by not embracing the American approach. And as you probably know, America is not a socialist republic. It's very free market and capitalist. They have absolutely no problem with punitive damages. They just don't. Okay. The other thing they have in America is class actions. If someone was suing McDonald's for racism here, it's a single case, and I take it on, I run it, and try and get the best I can for them. Yeah. Average award being $12,000 pre-dismissal plus loss of earnings. In the States, I'm entitled to write to McDonald's and say I want the name of every black employee you employ and all their contact details, and I'm going to write to all of them to ask if they've suffered similar treatment. Then you suddenly have 10,000 people suing, and you have a multi-million claim. And it works because it terrifies the living hell out of these big employers, yeah? In this country, we're just stuck on the one case. There's one exception to that, and that's called the Birmingham City Council case, because there's a guy called Stephen Cross, who's an ex-trade union lawyer. He discovered that when trade unions were doing deals with local authorities, deals would often favour the male members of a union because most members of a union were men. Yeah, so the men tended to work in separate types of fields or industries within a local authority. So he got together 200 women, roughly 200, who were cooks, cleaners and carers who sued for equal pay. How much were they awarded by the Employment Tribunal? 1,200 million. 1.2 billion. Even though on paper for gender pay reporting women were paid more than men at Birmingham City Council on average, the true debt owed to those 200 women in equal pay was £1,200 million. Birmingham City Council had to sell all of its property, including the National Exhibition Centre, and borrow £300 million from the government to avoid going bankrupt. Okay. Afterwards, the government banned equal pay questionnaires, which meant you could never ever get that same data again because pay is confidential. So the £1 trillion currently owed to female workers in equal pay can't be recovered. There are a couple of big claims, one I think is against ASDA, that are ongoing, where they've managed to assemble enough of the female staff to run the case with enough of the pay data. But for most women, they'll never ever recover that equal pay debt, which is a legally owed debt. And that's the structural picture. So women are still paid 18% less than men and are owed £1 trillion in back pay. They'll never get it. And you know probably that women are paid 18% less than men for equal value of work. How much are black people paid less than white people for equal value of work? Very little research is done about that. It's between 26 and 39%. Okay? The total equal pay owed to black workers is currently £300 billion. Can you imagine if the government gave £300 billion to black workers in this country, how it would transform this country in terms of equality and diversity? But they'll never be allowed to get it. So that's the structural picture, and that's why things don't change even though individuals bravely fight on. And when you read in the papers another landmark decision or somebody getting a record award, understand that that's just dealing with the 1%. So all the lies they say in the press about this country having a compensation culture, it's the opposite of the truth. 99% of victims do not sue, do not get compensated, and just suffer in silence. And it's the suffering in silence which we're trying to do something about through the Parliament talk. So I'll give you two stories. So there's a black woman who set up a magazine for black girls, did very well. It's stocked in quite a lot of supermarkets, yeah? So that's good on diversity. She went, this is in the last year, she went to Tesco's with her daughter, realised when we were halfway around the store that she was being followed by store detectives because there were two black people in the supermarket. They were asked what their intentions were, whether they're there to steal. She said, no, I'm just here to do my shopping. You actually stock my magazine. So she called the manager. The guy who I think is a supervisor, but may be a manager, came over. She explained the situation. He said he's very sorry for what happened. Would she like a bunch of bananas to take with her home? Yeah. Now, so there's a lot of racism about black people and monkeys. So she started filming him and said, could you repeat what he said? And he repeated it. He said, yeah, you can have a bunch of bananas if you want. We're sorry. And smirked. And then he said, well, you can have pears or apples. It's up to you. And smirked again. Yeah? It went viral. This is about 7 months ago. May 24. Another black person was his friend. He's in his 60s. His friend's in his 60s. Teaches salsa or tango or something like that. Had a stroke. And he asked him if he could help him with his shopping at Asda. So he travelled across London and he's walking around Asda with a guy and they're crawling around like 1 mile an hour. But by just the guy's had a stroke, he can't really run. So they realised after a while that 6 guys, security staff, were following them around because, again, they're the only 2 black people in this Asda. Yeah? And they stopped them and questioned, what's your intentions? Are you trying to steal stuff? But what really did this guy's head in is one of the female security officers said, a friend of mine, he's had a curse put on him. I just wondered if you knew how to remove a voodoo curse. So racist stereotypes. And these are daily indignities that black people face and suffer, and it damages their mental health, makes them feel unsafe, unwelcome. More and more of my clients in the last 5 years are not only talking about how the system's failing them, but they feel that they should leave the country because they don't feel safe there anymore. And that's a scary phenomenon. But it's not random, and it's not just arisen out of the ether. It's because there's an ideological cultural war being waged every day by reform and people right-wing of reform who want to destroy and make black people in this country feel they're living in a hostile environment. Yeah, and you don't see it until you're walking around Asda or Tesco, and then you're accused when you're just minding your own business. Yeah, and then the same thing's happening on the misogyny side, because a lot of the white supremacist stuff leads into misogyny as well. They're not going away. They're hugely well-resourced. So the lack of safety that people feel now is only going to get worse. So what we're trying to do is put together an organisation that can fight back against that. That's what the 25th of April event's about at the University of East London. Can we bond together and push back?
Thank you. When we talked about employment law in general, we were talking about how judges back in the day had this mindset against certain people, certain race, maybe they were misogynistic.
Yeah.
Over the years, we have seen reforms come up, but as we were talking to you, we understand it's getting worse. Yeah. Where do you think this problem lies? Is it the people themselves? Because we talked about Andrew Tate. Yeah. We talked about certain personalities who are out there on the internet, who are out there in the media. Maybe they are being backed by certain organizations. They are being pushed down people's throat. That 11-year-olds know about Andrew Tate. Yeah. People of certain age agree with such things. Where do you think this problem lies? Is it the human nature of it that these people, it just comes down? Is it the enforcement of law by the people, the body who's making this law, or is it the employers themselves?
Okay, that's a huge one. So I think it's the structure of our society and the history. So in the last 50 years, under the British Survey of Attitudes, 25% of people have admitted to being very or a little racist. They've admitted it. It's not as if they denied it. Yeah. So if 25% of people in this country are racist to a little or very extent, you have a 1 in 4 chance of bumping into a racist in education, in employment, in your online life, in your offline life. Yeah. So it's theoretically possible as a black person you can go through the whole of your life without encountering any racism at all. But it's also statistically likely that you will. So that's ingrained into the system, and the legal protections we have don't work, so they haven't changed the culture or the underlying structure, and you need legislation that understands that structural discrimination or institutional racism exists, and therefore you have punitive damages. For example, let's say I did a case once where a black guy was pinned against a wall at work and called the N-word. Yeah. How much was he awarded for that?
I mean, it should be
£2,500. It took me a whole day to convince that judge to raise it from £1,500, which was his preference, to £2,500. Does £2,500 compensate you for being pinned against a wall and called the N-word in front of other staff? Not really, no. So that's the problem in the system. So if he got £10 million, the manager would have been sacked, the culture, organisational culture would have changed, and everything would have improved, and it probably wouldn't have happened, yeah? Because at the moment the awards are so low, it doesn't encourage the employer to change what it's doing. So partly it's about having enforceable rights and punitive damages and a litigation fund or independent commission that will run the case for you, as they have in the States. Part of it is about the structure and the history, but one thing's for sure, individuals can't really make a difference. I mean, if you think of the worst race case we've had probably in our history, which is a Stephen Lawrence murder in 93, that led to a public inquiry. McPherson or Lawrence report led to change in legislation, but the situation on the ground, according to Doreen Lawrence, is as bad now as it was in the 90s in terms of stop and search and discrimination when we met. So it's made no difference at all. And one of the absolutely terrible failures of that was that institutional racism, everyone kind of understands what that means. It's not illegal. It was never made illegal. Yeah? So they captured a really important right for us, but never legislated it. So if the Metropolitan Police is institutionally racist at the moment, you can't sue for it. There's nothing you can do about it. And one of the funny things post Baroness Casey is, if you know about Casey report, which in 2023 found meant to be institutionally racist, is that a lot of black officers have brought cases after that saying, yeah, that's me. I got put on a misconduct, which I shouldn't do. I was denied promotion. This is exactly what Casey is saying. But they're going to a tribunal and they're losing because the judge is saying you don't have enough evidence. But it's an institutionally racist place, but that's not illegal. You need something more. You need a magic ingredient. You don't have it, you lose. The Commissioner's response to Casey was what? He removed legally qualified chairs, which removed all the independent protection from misconduct panels, and he increased the size of the DPS or anti-corruption department by 50%, even though Casey had identified the DPS as the problem and engine of institutional racism. So his response to Casey was to increase the one department that was causing the problem by 50%, and the Home Office funded that. Casey's supposed to come back this month to do a 2-year review. What's happened? But apparently the Commissioner's refused that, saying that she's anti-police, and the Home Office has sent her off to deal with social care. So she's now out of the picture. So look out for who does the review.
Interesting.
Yeah, because I suspect they will find everything's improved massively and everything's great. And then in 10 years' time, there'll be another Stephen Lawrence type report saying they're institutionally racist, and we'll go around in circles again.
Thank you so much for today. I'll have to wrap it up. I've got people waiting to jump
No,
on.
that's fine. I
could
see the panicking
that's
waves.
Fine. Like,
yeah.
So no,
Get
that's
him
all.
out the room as fast as you can.
No, it's been lovely, and thank you so much. And thanks for coming in, and thank you to our lovely visitors and our lovely students for putting the questions forward. And to our listeners, thank you for listening, and we will be back and stay connected. Now, if you do wish to get involved with our Law, Policing and Justice podcast, please email the Legal Advice Centre at uel.ac.uk. And if you wish to explore more on the Law, Policing and Justice courses, please visit www.uel.ac.uk. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and stay well.